All right, welcome to the chapter on schizophrenia. And what we're going to be looking at is schizophrenia is among one of the most puzzling and disabling clinical syndromes. Schizophrenia touches every facet of an afflicted person's life. Acute episodes are characterized by delusions, hallucinations, illogical thinking, incoherent speech, and bizarre behavior. Between episodes, people may still be able to think, unable to think clearly, and lack appropriate emotional responses to people and events in their lives. In this video, we're going to look at some of the background history of where the diagnosis came from and review the phases and features of current DSM-5 schizophrenia diagnosis. So let's get on with this. This is part one, and we'll carry on right now. Looking at clinical features of schizophrenia, we're going to look at the historical conceptions of schizophrenia. And Emil Kraepelin was the first to describe the syndrome that we now know as schizophrenia. Now, mind you, he didn't call it that. He labeled the disorder Dementia Praecox. And he believed that it was a disease that developed early in life and followed a progressively deteriorating course. He thought that there was a disease process. And although he did not know what exactly what the process was, but it was a deteriorating kind of experience. Much of what he described, things like hallucinations, delusions, odd motor behavior, are still typical in the description of what we describe as schizophrenia today. Eugene Bleuler, he renamed the disorder schizophrenia, and he believed that its course was a more variable, less disease-like, less progressive in a line, and more variable. He also distinguished between the primary symptoms, of which he described as the 4 A's. You'll find these on page 353 to 355, a description of what they were. And then he also described secondary symptoms, which he would call the delusions and hallucinations. Now, if we move a little more currently, we enter into looking at Kurt Schneider, and according to him, hallucinations and delusions are numbered among the first, what he described as first-rank symptoms of schizophrenia. That is, symptoms of schizophrenia that are central to the diagnosis. So hallucinations and delusions were first rank because they were most noticeable, most predominant to the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And then he had what were so-called second-rank symptoms, which are found to be in other disorders as well, but Schneider considered confusion and disturbances in mood to be second-rank symptoms rather than first. Now, Kraepelin, Bleuler, and Schneider each have contributed to how schizophrenia is viewed and diagnosed today using the DSM-5, and you'll find this on table 10.1 on page 356. Now, what's the prevalence of schizophrenia in general population? Well, schizophrenia is believed to affect about 1% of the population, so it's not particularly big. However, if you look at any population of 100 million people, you would say that there's 1 million people affected by schizophrenia. Now, Canada is not that big, but you're still looking at a very large number of about 400,000, 350,000 people with diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia usually develops in late adolescence and early adulthood, and its onset may be an abrupt or gradual onset. The period of deterioration preceding the onset of acute symptoms would be those severe symptoms that we will recognize, those phase 1, if you will, hallucinations and delusions, that the pre-phase, or the preceding to the onset, is what's called the primordial phase. And you see that on the left. This is the period of deterioration. Things start to diminish, start to deteriorate, but the major, more acute or active phase hasn't been achieved. An acute episode involves the emergence of clear psychotic features. And then the residual phase is characterized by the level of functioning that was typical of the prodromal phase. Now, in my experience in working with people with schizophrenia, that there is this resembles what is known as decompensation, and this is where a person will go through stages of phases, if you will, of schizophrenia. They start out going through this prodromal, have an acute phase, go back down to residual phase, but the residual phase isn't the same exactly as promortal, and that over time, this is almost like a stair step down into what will ultimately be this person's, ultimate condition. Now, when we think in terms of schizophrenia, it comes with and is associated with some major features. Among the more predominant features in schizophrenia are are disorders in the content of thought. Now, disorders of content of thought include delusions. And there's also, in this disorder, form of thought disorders, which are basically thought disorders. And as well as the presence of perceptual disorders, hallucinations. This could be either visual or auditory, and as we'll describe later, even more complex than that. And emotional disturbances, which is a flattening or inappropriate affect, and we'll get into this in the next slide. There's also dysfunction in the brain process that regulate attention to the external world. Now, starting with disturbances of content of thought, delusions, the most common of these are delusions. Delusions are basically false beliefs that are enduring. That is, they last for a while and they lack any evidence. Delusions of prosecution, the police are out to get me, or some other person or group. Delusions of being controlled, that the belief that there are thoughts or feelings or impulses are controlled by outside forces and agents, even the devil, as are influencing you. You're not making your own choice up, but you're in fact being controlled. Delusions of grandeur, the belief in the false impression that you have great importance. You might believe that you're Jesus, or that you're going to save the world, or that you will invent the thing that will make the world run in a much more better way. And then there are also a class of delusions that are other way known. That is delusions like thought broadcasting, thought insertion, thought withdrawal. You'll find these on page 358. Now, delusions certainly are not the only element. There is, as mentioned in the beginning portion of that last slide, I've talked about disturbances of form of thought. Now, this will include things like when, normally you and I have these experiences of disturbances in form of thought. We're daydreaming or just letting our thoughts wander, and that's normal. Otherwise, our thoughts are rational, logical, and they're tied together. Now, thoughts of people with schizophrenia tend to be more disorganized, illogical, more disturbed. These are known as thought disorders, or the breakdown of the logical associations. And so you see an example here of some writings. So this will be a logical breakdown of associations of thoughts. Poverty of speech is also common. Speech that is coherent but limited and vague, with little information or value, less common. Neologisms, which are made-up words, and they have no particular meaning. You'll find that neologisms will also occur in some forms of dementia and Alzheimer's. Preservation, which is the repetition of thoughts and words. In other disorders, this is called echocholia, the repeating of words and phrases. And then there would be clanging, putting words together because they rhyme or they sound alike, and then blocking, the involuntary abrupt interruption of speech and thought. You might be on a stream of thought, a way of thinking, and then all of a sudden an abrupt shift into some other form of communication or speech or thought. And there's no smooth transition, it's an abrupt shift. Now these would be some other major disturbances of form of thought. Carrying on with major features, we can get into attentional deficiencies, being able to focus and pay attention to relevant stimuli in normal expectations. With schizophrenia, there's a breakdown in the process of attention and therefore are very easily distracted by other and varied stimuli. Hypervigilance, this is the oversensitivity to stimuli, not being able to filter out things and focus. Perceptual disturbances, hallucinations and images perceived without any external stimuli. The hallucinations can involve any of the senses: auditory, somatic, feeling, gustatory. Gustatory would be taste, olfactory, which would be smell. Auditory and visual are the most common. Auditory hallucinations occur in about 60% of the cases. Auditory hallucinations can be voices inside or external from the person. Either you hear them inside your head as if it's your own self-talk, or you hear them as if they're coming from someone outside of you, like a third person. They can come in the form of a command. They can be instructions to do things to harm yourself. Some of the causes of hallucinations, well, they're not really known. It's speculation, brain chemistry disturbances, subvocalizations, and otherwise unrecognized self-talk. The interconnectedness of our brain may in some way be responsible for undetermined causes. Now what you're seeing is in the top right-hand corner there is emotional disturbances in terms of affect. Thus, when someone has a flat affect, it's essentially the lack of emotional expression in the face and in the voice, lacking a normal range of emotional responses. The reality may not be no emotional complexity, but rather the emotions are not communicated to the outside world, but are experienced otherwise. There are many other types of impairments when it comes to the major features of schizophrenia. Now, just as a general overview, you'll find more of these in your textbook, more explanation. But when you look at the categorical model, the way that they divide symptoms in terms of positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Positive include hallucinations, disorganized speech, thought disorder, delusions, and inappropriate affect. Now, if you're looking at secondary symptoms, you're looking at social withdrawal, flat affect, poverty of speech, social skill deficiencies, and loss of pleasure in activities. Remember, the things that you see on the right-hand side of your screen are things that you'll see in other psychological disorders. But the things you see on the left-hand side, the positive symptoms, are things that are more likely to be examples of schizophrenia. So what you've maybe noticed, and this is one of the differences between the DSM-IV and the DSM-V, is you're not seeing categorizations or names of schizophrenia that include what was in the DSM-V. That is things like catatonia, paranoid schizophrenia. You won't see those terms because they're not used now. The DSM-V now looks at things more in terms of major features, the positive and negative, categorical model of what schizophrenia is. So this is one of those big shifts in the look at schizophrenia as a psychological disorder from looking at the DSM-V and the DSM-IV. All right, there we are. The next video we're going to look at the theory and treatments. Carry on and have a good day. Bye now.